All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church, building community, inspiring growth, creating change. Here in the heart of Kansas City, we come together to create this hour of shared reflection so that we might be renewed in courage for these times and inspired to lives of greater dignity, higher purpose, deeper generosity, and more effective action. If you are new to Unitarian Universalism or to our congregation, we want to get to know you and share a part of your journey. If this place is already your spiritual home, welcome back. We need one another, and it is good to be together again. We are so excited to be together in person again after almost 2 years of gathering only online during the coronavirus pandemic. Nevertheless, through the gifts of technology, we continue to celebrate community and connections with each other online also, as we lean into the values of justice, compassion, and reason. Together, we learn the love that has the power to overcome both loneliness in the heart and oppression in the world. Welcome to our service this morning. May the words and music and images that we offer today nourish our best selves, calling forth abundant wisdom and love.
Arise, O souls, all arise.
Good morning. And welcome to everyone joining us on this warm, early summer morning. Today, we observe the celebration of Juneteenth and rejoice with formerly enslaved people everywhere in the promise of freedom, both real and yet to be made real. We notice the longest day and briefest night of the year this Tuesday, as the solstice brings the beginning of the summer season, and the days start to shorten now, little by little, until the next turning in December. Also today, we lift up the legacy of fatherhood and give thanks for those biological fathers, spiritual fathers, and father figures who have helped to shape our lives and bequeath to us the heritage of generations. The poet Antoine de Saint-Exupéry puts it this way: in a house which becomes a home, one hands down and another takes up the heritage of mind and heart, laughter and tears, musings and deeds. Love, like a carefully loaded ship, crosses the gulf between the generations. Let us bring up our children. It is not the place of some official to hand to them their heritage. If others impart to our children our knowledge and ideals, they will lose all of us that is wordless and full of wonder. Rather, let us build memories in our children, lest they drag out joyless lives, lest they allow treasures to be lost because they have not been given the keys. We live not by things, but by the meanings of things. It is needful to transmit the passwords from generation to generation. The flame of our kindled chalice is one of those passwords from generation to generation. It carries the treasure of our faith in freedom, reason, justice, and compassion. May it be a key that we hand on in turn to those who come after us, hoping to build upon the foundations that we lay, the better world that we have dreamed together. Wherever that flame is lighted, our covenant community is summoned across time and space. May it unite our minds and hearts here in this room as well as across the miles. In its glow, may we remember that we share one world and that the well-being of Earth and all its creatures is essential to our own. Let us rise as we are willing and able and join our voices in song.
Touches one affects us all. The seas that wash us round about, the clouds that cover us, the rains that fall. Our world is one world. The thoughts we think affect us all. The way we build our attitudes with love or hate we make a bridge or wall. Our world is one world. Its ways of wealth affect us all. The way we spend, the way we share, or poor, who stand or fall. Our world is one world, just like a ship that bears us all, where fear and greed make many holes, but where our hearts can hear a different
and speak together the words of our commitment to this community. Together we affirm, goodwill is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Have a seat, and let's be reminded of what Juneteenth is all about.
Juneteenth. On June 19th, 1866, 1 year after they learned of their freedom, freed African Americans came together to celebrate. The city of Galveston was alive with music. The sweet, smoky smell of barbecue filled the air. Black Texans were wearing their Sunday best. They gathered and hugged. They shared news and told stories. They sang spirituals celebrating freedom. No more slavery chains for me. No more, no more. Folks attended ceremonies, worship services, and parades to mark the day. This was the first of many June 19th celebrations in Texas. And when Black Texans moved to other states, they took the tradition with them. But how did June 19th become Juneteenth? At first, Texans called it Freedom Day, Emancipation Day, Jubilee, or simply June 19th. As years passed and freedom's stories were told and retold, June and 19th blended together into Juneteenth. Today, Juneteenth is celebrated much like that first anniversary in 1866. People of all colors arrive at parks, churches, schools, and backyards for picnics. The sweet, smoky smell of barbecue fills the air. Potato salad, corn on the cob, biscuits, homemade ice cream, cakes, pies, and melons crowd the tables. Red velvet cake and red soda pop are traditional treats. Red honors all the people whose blood was shed in slavery and in the struggle for freedom. Festive parades fill city streets with music and dancing. Black cowboys and cowgirls clomp through town on horses. Miss Juneteenth waves from a decorated float. Folks stroll along singing songs of freedom and patriotism. Spirited basketball games bring whoops and hollers from excited fans. Foot races, sack races, and rodeos spark cheers and laughter. At the cakewalk, people clap their hands and tap their feet. Dancers turn and leap, strut and quick step to win the grand prize, a delicious cake. Worship services and readings of the Emancipation Proclamation are important parts of Juneteenth. Speakers tell and retell stories of slavery and freedom. They share tales of why enslaved Texans were the last to get the news. One legend says that the first messenger sent with the proclamation was murdered along the way. Another story says he was given a very, very slow mule to ride. People laugh, but no one forgets the real reason for the late news. No one forgets that Juneteenth is not just a day to have fun. It is a time to remember. Juneteenth is celebrated in big or small ways almost everywhere in the United States. The government of Texas made it a state holiday on January 1st, 1980. From Florida to Alaska, California to New Jersey, other states across the nation have followed this example. Many people believe that June 19th should be a national holiday, like Thanksgiving or the 4th of July. Wherever it is celebrated, Juneteenth is a time to sing praises for the end of slavery in the United States.
And it is worth noting that this year, for the first time, we're celebrating Juneteenth as a federal holiday. Yay. And now, any children who have been with us and are ready to depart to their classes may do so with song.
Go now in peace, may love guide all your ways. Beauty be the blessing of your nights and days. Truth on your lips and kindness in your deeds. Faith to follow where the human spirit leads.
It has been easy in the flurry of preparations for my travel to our national and international UUA General Assembly in person for the first time in 3 years, to forget that this service today is meant to be the last one I will conduct as a full-time minister. It's easy to forget because I will be preaching again the first week in July, so it doesn't feel like I'm missing a beat. But the truth is that the next time I stand in this pulpit, we will have transitioned to a new fiscal year, and my work in the church will have reduced to half-time. Be assured that the search committee is earnestly at work seeking a colleague to partner with me as I engage this attempt to find a more sustainable balance of the work that I love, the family that I love, the garden and sewing and writing that I love, and the rest that feels more and more urgent in both my body and my spirit. This is a poignant moment for me, as all such turning pages are. I am deeply grateful that we are not saying goodbye at all for several more years, and I so appreciate your many messages of support and encouragement. Thank you. It has been a joy and an honor to serve the mission of this congregation with you all for the past 10 years, and to look ahead to several more years of work and witness together. All of this is made possible by the generosity that sustains our community financially over time. Your gifts, large and small, are the nurturing soil in which our shared ministry is given practical form and thrives. We make the act of giving a part of our weekly gathering in order to remind ourselves and each other that money, too, is a sacred strand in the interdependent web that we celebrate, a manifestation of our values and our aspirations, an expression of what it means to be human in community. We invite one another now into a gesture of mutual generosity and commitment to this institution that we cherish, to its heritage and its future. In that spirit, the offering for this morning will now be gladly given and gratefully received.
Have courage, my soul, and let us journey on. For though the night is dark, it won't be very long. Oh, thanks be to God, the morning light appears, and the storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah. Billows rolling high and thunder shakes the ground. The lightnings flash and tempest all around, but Jesus walks the sea and calms the angry waves, and the storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah. The stars have disappeared disappeared, and distant lights are dim. My soul is filled with fears. The seas are breaking in. I hear the master cry, be not afraid, 'tis I. And the storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Will you join me in the words of dedication for our offering? We dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society.
Due to the United States 18th century Indian policy, 5 tribes, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations, had adopted African chattel slavery in the same model as white Europeans and Americans. Some members of these tribes became quite wealthy through the plantation-style agricultural fruits of black labor. The forced removal of the 5 tribes from their homelands in the southeastern United States to Indian Territory in the 1830s also included the African American slaves owned by many tribe members. How does this history connect to the 1921 Tulsa Massacre? After the end of the Civil War, the U.S. government forced all 5 slave-holding Indian nations to free their slaves and give them each 40 acres of land from the tribal reservations. On their acres, in what is now Ardmore, a small south-central Oklahoman town about a 3-hour drive from Tulsa, my own family raised cows and chickens, planted fruit trees, and operated a general store. The land and freedoms enjoyed by people like my family and others formerly enslaved by Indians served as a beacon of hope for many Southern African Americans searching for a new place free from violence and open to black settlement and property ownership.
At that same time, oil and natural gas exploration began in earnest in this region, creating white, black, and Native American millionaires, and serving as an additional motivator, along with the 1862 Homestead Act, for African American migration. The black population of Indian Territory, which became the state of Oklahoma in 1907, had increased from 19,000 to over 80,000 between 1890 and 1907. These black immigrants became settlers, entrepreneurs, building businesses, schools, churches, and communities. At its height, Tulsa's Black Wall Street was home to rooming houses, movie theaters, grocery stores, auto repair shops, dentist office, among other businesses. The region became known as one of the wealthiest black locales in the country, hence the term Black Wall Street. The area became famous for the wealth of its entrepreneurial African American citizens. And remember, the land these businesses and homes were built on was previously occupied by members of the Creek Nation and their black slaves.
We'll build a land where we bind up the broken. We'll build a land where the captives go free, where the oil of gladness dissolves all mourning. Oh, we'll build a promised land that can be. Come, build a land where people together, anointed by vision, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land where we bring the good tidings to all the afflicted and all those who mourn, and we'll give them garlands instead of ashes. Oh, we'll build a land where peace is born. We'll build a land building up ancient cities, raising up devastations of old, restoring ruins of generations. Oh, we'll be a land of people so bold. Come, build a land where people together, anointed by vision, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream, and peace like an ever-flowing stream.
If the central question of antiquity was who is God, and the central question of the Enlightenment and modernism has been, who am I? It seems clear that the most urgent dilemma of our own 21st century postmodernism has to be, what do you mean we? Is there really such a thing as a collective us? And if so, who is included? Both science and anthropology have learned enough about interdependence to realize that the individual I is meaningless without a larger context, the we within which that I functions, and out of which it learns to manifest its human identity. Most significantly, liberation and resistance theology teaches us to ask, who is the implicit, default we? When, for instance, those gathered for worship sing a hymn like "We'll Build a Land," who is that we? White people? European colonials? Christians? The ancient covenant Hebrew community for whom the biblical prophets spoke? When a black voice, and thank you, Darrington, for making it possible for us to hear this, when a person like Darrington sings this song, does the image of what you always thought it meant waver and shift and refocus with a new layer of meaning? What generations of anguished history and culture of determined hope are implied when a black person invites people together to unite and create peace? As the playground taunt inquires, is that a promise or a threat? Who is we? And how does the meaning of that question and its answer change if one brings Native American tribal people into the equation as well? Although it sometimes feels as if we are discovering them for the first time, our generation is not, in fact, the first to confront these questions. And never were they more urgently contested than in the years and decades that followed the American Civil War. As we remember today on the holiday of Juneteenth, freedom came slowly and reluctantly in the states of the defeated Confederacy. It was not until this date in 1865, well more than a year after the Emancipation Proclamation and months after the formal end of the war, that the enslaved people of Texas received the announcement of their freedom from a Union general in Galveston. The following year, on the anniversary date, many gathered again, partly to celebrate with abundant food and fancy clothes forbidden during slave times, partly to seek word of lost relatives, children, siblings, and other kinfolk separated by the workings of the slave trade, and partly to receive instructions in how to register and vote. Speaking of land, it is worth remembering that as the Jim Crow system of segregation began to be implemented, while Juneteenth celebrations were spreading to cities across Texas, it became forbidden in many places for blacks to gather in public parks. In 1872, the former Freedmen's Bureau in Austin, Texas, addressed this problem by raising funds for the purchase of 10 acres of land, which would become known as Emancipation Park. Such civic accommodations were not always granted by the local white power structures. And across the agricultural South, there was a concerted refusal to sell property to former slaves. Tenant farming, which soon became debt peonage, served to keep independent blacks from accumulating wealth or establishing security, thus replicating as closely as possible for white citizens the previous structural relationships of slavery. Ambitious black families who hoped to get ahead, as they phrased it, expected to find greater opportunities in frontier states where land was plentiful and the culture of racial inequality not so entrenched. Fast forward to the early 1920s in the young boom town of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the 35 blocks called the Greenwood neighborhood formed the heart of what was known across the country as Black Wall Street. As we heard in the reading, this was a relatively self-sufficient and independent economic ecosystem operated by and for the descendants of former slaves. It featured black-owned businesses, black professionals and artists, black-run schools, churches, and hospitals, pretty much everything needed for a prosperous town. Indeed, it functioned to take money out of white society through the pay received by all those residents who worked in white-owned industries or served in white homes or white businesses that they were forbidden to patronize, and then recirculated that money within the Greenwood community. Most of us here now know the story, though likely we did not learn it in history class, of how a minor accident was fanned into a flame of arson and massacre on May 30th and 31st, 1921, in which white hooligans with the connivance of city authorities killed between 100 and 300 black residents of Greenwood and utterly destroyed by looting and fire the entire neighborhood. It is a tale of horror that was not entirely unique. Freestanding and rising black communities in several other cities were similarly destroyed by what were popularly termed race riots during the decades of the teens and 20s. But Greenwood was the most spectacular of these because it was nationally known as the model of what black citizens could achieve for themselves and their community if given a chance. And so the question arises, why Tulsa? Why did the Black Wall Street of the nation arise at that location in particular? You might think it was arbitrary chance. After all, the most prosperous black neighborhood had to be somewhere. But there is more to the story. As I said, it all depends on what you mean by we. You may recall that when Christopher Columbus made landfall in what is now the Bahamas, he had, among other ambitions, a plan to enslave the indigenous people he encountered, whom he identified as Indians because of his mistaken understanding of how large the Earth's circumference would be. Like other European explorers and colonists after him, he was to be disappointed. The natives of the New World were resistant to the notion of slavery, although they had little resistance to the infectious diseases of Europe. They died from epidemics of smallpox and other unfamiliar contagions, and if they survived such risks, they easily melted back into their familiar landscapes with the assistance of their own or other tribal peoples. There was too little profit to be made for the colonials to persist in the enslavement endeavor. They soon concluded that genocide would be more efficient and decisive. The other alternative, for which the indigenous people had equally limited enthusiasm, was to civilize the so-called Indians by persuading them to adopt European culture and become part of the European colonial society. In time, the southern East Coast tribal nations identified as the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole were thought to have adopted enough white ideas and practices that they became known as the 5 civilized tribes. These cultural adaptations included Christianity, English literacy, market economics, centralized government, and, wait for it, the ownership of kidnapped Africans in chattel slavery. That is correct. The indigenous Americans, having proved themselves unsuitable for the uses of enslavement, became, in some instances, slave owners themselves. And when even this was not enough to save them from the newly independent nation's greed for their land, their African slaves went with them on the infamous Trail of Tears and other forced removals to designated Indian lands on the frontier in the years before the Civil War. Thus it was that the very last enforcement of freedom for enslaved Africans occurred in 1866, when the U.S. Congress abrogated all existing treaties with the Chickasaw Nation on the pretext that the tribe had sided with the Confederacy during the war and forced it to distribute nearly half of its previously negotiated land to the former slaves that it refused to recognize as hereditary tribal members. Others of the 5 tribes were subjected to similar requirements, so that while former slaves were unable to buy land among their erstwhile owners in the Confederate States, Native Americans were forced to make good on the promise of 40 acres of their reservation lands distributed to their newly emancipated slaves. Many government administrators may have thought that this was no big deal. The land in question was in most cases harsh and unsuitable for farming. But that was several decades before the 1897 discovery of oil beneath that unpromising landscape, setting off an oil boom which created the city of Tulsa, along with scores of white, black, and Native American millionaires. This was the source of the capital that several enterprising heirs of slaves invested in the creation of civic and corporate infrastructure in Greenwood that would, in the ensuing 20 years, propel it to the status of the Black Wall Street of America. The tension between hereditary members of the 5 tribes and the descendants of their former slaves was exacerbated at every turn by the federal government's efforts to end collective tribal ownership of reservation land through making allotments to individual members of tribal nations, while refusing to recognize that by the end of the Civil War, most of those enslaved were of mixed Indian and African heritage. The question of whether it was more advantageous to be recognized as a U.S. citizen like other former slaves or as a tribal member entitled to treaty rights was quite situational and often pitted the 2 marginalized groups against each other to the benefit of white authorities and would-be landowners. The 1921 massacre was driven both by ideology and by pragmatic interests. The once undesirable real estate near the railroad tracks where Greenwood was located had, since the turn of the century, become premium commercial land. The city was eager to build an elegant new train station, and the city council, encouraged by the Tulsa Real Estate Exchange, quickly passed new fire codes intended to make it impossible for previous owners to rebuild burned-out properties in the wake of the destruction. No insurance company ever paid a claim by a Black resident of Greenwood, although one white owner of an adjacent pawn shop was compensated for damages that he suffered in the melee. However, not for nothing had Black Wall Street had its share of black lawyers, and together they pushed back against the city's effort to prevent their community from resurrecting itself. Ultimately, the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled that the city council's fire ordinance was illegal, and many homeowners spent the following winter living in tents on their ruined grounds so that they could not be accused of abandoning the property while waiting for the opportunity to start construction in the spring of '22. By 1926, Greenwood once again had more hotels than Harlem. Then came the crash of White Wall Street in 1929, and by 1933, redlining had come to Tulsa. Since then, the Greenwood area has suffered all the typical urban renewal efforts that have challenged many Black inner-city neighborhoods, including the construction of a multi-lane highway through the midst of it. As the century anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre has come and gone, trailing a spate of news coverage and retrospectives, the nation's conscience has briefly taken pause over this previously little-known history. Yet still few and far between are those who make the connections between the practice of slavery by Native American tribes forcibly acculturated and forcibly removed from their lands, and the investment that enabled the creation of America's wealthiest and most self-sufficient community of the children and grandchildren of those former slaves. On this Juneteenth, let those of us who benefit, whether we want to or not, from the privileges of white skin and European ancestry, ask ourselves once again, more deeply, what we mean by we. On this Father's Day, who are our ancestors? The white colonizers who built the city of Tulsa on what had once been Muskogee and Osage land? The Cherokee and Chickasaw survivors of violent relocation seeking to preserve their identity in the wake of a war for the future of a government that wanted them to disappear? The former slaves torn between Indian culture and the rising tide of Jim Crow, hoping against hope to build a place of safety and prosperity for their descendants. Come build a land, called the ancient prophets, the promised land, the land that can be. That is not a project that any of us can undertake alone. No independent Cartesian intellect can make a community happen. There has to be a we. But beware the pesky detail of who is not included in that enterprise. Their unheard voices will return to haunt the Golden City, and their suffering will be carried forward in the trauma of generations. For in the end, there is no true prosperity that does not have its foundation in justice, and no authentic security that is not rooted in the premise of equality and freedom. Human beings are always building something, lands and cities, either bridges or walls, and we is always larger than you think. Will you sing with me?
Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound. justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land where I'm bound. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land where I'm bound, where I'm bound. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land. There'll be singing in that land where I'm bound.
Woohoo! We release this chalice flame, sending the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment out into the world. And these we also carry in our minds and hearts until we are together again. The poet Marge Piercy says this about community: two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house or eat pie for dinner with no seconds and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 and you have solidarity in your own newsletter. 10,000 power in your own paper. 100,000 your own media. 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more.